waving at the ball like a madman.
Yeah,
Get over! Get over! Get over!
What if your brain started failing and you were the last person to understand it? Not suddenly, not in a dramatic collapse, but slowly, quietly, in ways that feel small at first and impossible to ignore later. You wake up feeling off, not sad, not tired, just wrong. Like something inside your head isn't working the way it used to. Thoughts don't connect, words disappear mid-sentence. Simple things take effort. Then the nights get worse. You can't sleep, your mind won't stop, anxiety shows up without a reason, fear appears without a source. And then it gets disturbing. You start seeing things that aren't there. Not imagination, not dreams, but something that feels real enough to make you question your own mind. People tell you it's stress, maybe depression, that you just need rest. But deep down, you know this isn't normal. Because this isn't just how you feel. This is how you think, breaking down in real time. And here's the part most people don't understand. You know something is wrong, but your brain can't explain it to you anymore. Now imagine going through all of that while the entire world expects you to be sharp, fast, and in control. Someone whose identity depends on thinking quicker than everyone else in the room. That person was Robin Williams. And when the world said he died from depression, they were only seeing part of the story. Because what was really happening to him was something far more disturbing. Something that had already taken control long before anyone realized it.
To the world, Robin Williams wasn't just funny. He was uncontrollable in the best way possible. A performer whose mind moved so fast it felt almost impossible to keep up. He didn't just tell jokes, he created entire realities on the spot, switching voices, personalities, and emotions in seconds, turning chaos into something brilliant. On screen, he could make you laugh and then, without warning, hit you with something deeply human, something that stayed with you long after the scene ended. He won an Academy Award, starred in some of the most iconic films of his time, and became more than just an actor. He became a feeling, the person people turned to when they needed joy. But that's exactly what made everything harder to see. Because when someone is always on, always performing, always giving energy to everyone else, we stop asking what it costs them. And here's where it gets unsettling. That level of speed, that intensity, that constant mental activity, it didn't just define his success. It may have also hidden the first signs that something was going wrong. Because when your baseline is already extraordinary, early changes don't look like warning signs. They look like variation. A missed line doesn't raise concern. A moment of hesitation feels normal. A little anxiety seems understandable. And that's how it starts. Not with something obvious, but with something subtle. Something that blends in just enough to be ignored. But beneath that unstoppable image, beneath the energy everyone admired, something had already begun to shift. Something that didn't fit the story people believed. And by the time it became noticeable, it was no longer small. It was already becoming something much more serious.
Looking back, the first signs were there, but they didn't look dangerous. They looked explainable, and that's exactly why they were ignored. Robin Williams started experiencing small shifts, the kind people dismiss without thinking twice. Trouble sleeping, rising anxiety, a constant sense that something wasn't quite right. Not sadness in a clear, identifiable way, but instability, like his mind wasn't syncing the way it used to. At first, it stayed subtle, easy to rationalize, easy to hide behind the pressure of work or the effects of age. But then something changed. He began forgetting lines, missing cues, hesitating in moments that should have been automatic for someone like him. And this is where it stops being normal. Because this wasn't just anyone. This was someone known for thinking faster than most people could follow. Someone who built his entire career on mental sharpness. When that kind of mind starts slowing down, even slightly, it doesn't go unnoticed. At least, not internally.
And that's what makes this stage so unsettling. because he reportedly became aware that something was off, but he couldn't clearly define it. Imagine feeling your own thinking change. Not enough to collapse, but enough to create doubt. Enough to make every mistake feel heavier than it should. That awareness doesn't calm you, it traps you. Because now every small failure feels like evidence that something bigger is happening underneath. From the outside, it still didn't look alarming. It looked like stress, like pressure, like a man dealing with too much at once. But that explanation only works when things stabilize, and in his case, they didn't. The anxiety grew stronger, focus became harder to maintain, and the sense of something being wrong became more persistent. And this is the part people often miss. The danger wasn't in how extreme the symptoms looked, it was in how slowly they were changing, blending into normal life just enough to avoid being questioned. Because while everyone was looking for emotional explanations, something else was already progressing underneath, something that didn't fit into the categories people understood. And by the time those early signs started connecting into a pattern, it was already far more advanced than anyone realized. Then came the diagnosis that seemed to explain everything, at least on the surface. In 2014, Robin Williams was told he had Parkinson's disease, a progressive neurological disorder that would eventually affect movement, coordination, and independence. And for someone whose identity depended on control, speed, and precision, that news hit hard. It wasn't just a medical label. It felt like a countdown, a clear signal that things were about to decline. And for a moment, it made sense. It gave a name to what was happening, something concrete, something people could understand. But this is where everything starts to break, because the symptoms he was experiencing didn't fully align with that diagnosis. Yes, there were physical ailments, but there was also something far more unpredictable: severe insomnia, overwhelming anxiety, moments of paranoia, and a growing sense that his thoughts were no longer entirely under his control. This wasn't just a steady progression. It was inconsistent, unstable, sometimes manageable, sometimes overwhelming. And that inconsistency is what made it so confusing. Treatment began based on what doctors believed was the problem. But when you're treating the wrong thing, even partially, the real issue doesn't stop. It keeps moving. It keeps developing underneath. And this is the part that changes everything. Because once a diagnosis is accepted, every new symptom gets interpreted through that lens, even when it doesn't quite fit. What should have raised deeper questions instead became part of an explanation that wasn't complete. And while it looked like they finally understood what he was facing, something far more complex was already unfolding beneath the surface. Something that didn't follow the rules people expected. Something that would soon push the situation into a place no one was prepared for. What doctors couldn't fully see at the time was already taking over his brain, and it explains everything that didn't make sense before. After his death, neurological examinations revealed that Robin Williams was suffering from Lewy body dementia, a condition caused by abnormal protein deposits that disrupt how different parts of the brain communicate with each other. And this is where it becomes disturbing, because this isn't just a disease that affects memory or movement. It interferes with perception itself, the way a person understands what is real and what is not. People with this condition can experience vivid hallucinations, moments where what they see feels completely real, even when it isn't. And at the same time, they can struggle with confusion, disorientation, and sudden shifts in awareness that make their own thoughts feel unreliable. This wasn't just emotional distress. This was a system breaking down in real time. According to medical reports, his case was severe and widespread, which explains why his symptoms felt inconsistent, why some days seemed manageable and others became overwhelming, and why treatments based on Parkinson's or depression didn't fully work. And here's the part that most people don't realize. Conditions like this are extremely difficult to diagnose, even for experienced specialists, because they overlap with so many other disorders. Meaning a person can be treated for something that only explains part of the problem, while the real cause continues to progress underneath. That's what makes this stage so unsettling, because while everything on the surface looked like it had an explanation, something else was quietly taking control, affecting how he thought, how he felt, and how he experienced reality itself. And the most terrifying part is not just that this was happening, but that he likely knew something was wrong, yet his own mind could no longer give him a clear answer, leaving him in a state where confusion, fear, and instability were not occasional, but increasingly constant, building towards something that was becoming harder and harder to manage.
At this point, it wasn't just symptoms anymore. It was a pattern, getting worse. Day by day, things became harder to manage, not in a straight line, but in unpredictable waves that made it impossible to feel stable. Robin Williams reportedly tried to fight it. He stayed active, exercised, followed treatment, did everything expected of someone trying to stay in control. But the problem is, when the brain itself is changing, effort doesn't always translate into improvement. Sleep became more difficult, anxiety more constant, and confusion more intrusive. Not just moments of distraction, but episodes where thinking clearly required effort that used to come naturally. And this is where it becomes deeply unsettling, because awareness didn't disappear, it stayed. He could feel that something was wrong, but he couldn't fully understand it. And that combination creates a kind of pressure that is hard to describe, because you're not just experiencing instability, you're watching it happen to yourself in real time. People around him could see the difference. They could sense the struggle. But even then, the full picture wasn't clear, because this kind of condition doesn't present in a simple, predictable way. It fluctuates, it hides, it creates moments of normality just long enough to make everything more confusing. And when your mind becomes unreliable, every thought feels heavier, every decision feels uncertain, and every moment requires more effort than it should. That's what defines this stage. Not just decline, but escalation. A growing loss of clarity combined with increasing emotional intensity. And when those two forces build together, they create a situation that becomes harder and harder to navigate, even under the best circumstances. And in his case, it was happening faster than anyone around him fully realized.
So what really happened in the end? For years, the public narrative was simple. Robin Williams was struggling with depression, a familiar explanation that fit what people expected to see. And to be clear, emotional distress may still have been part of what he experienced. But according to medical findings after his death, there was something much more complex happening. The presence of advanced Lewy body dementia changes the way the story is understood, because conditions like this don't just affect mood. They can alter perception, judgment, and the ability to interpret reality. Some experts suggest that severe neurological disorders can influence how a person processes fear and makes decisions, meaning what appears from the outside as a clear, conscious choice may feel very different from within a brain that is no longer functioning normally. But this is where we have to be careful. There is no definitive way to know exactly what he experienced in his final moments, and there is no confirmed evidence that a different diagnosis would have changed the outcome.
Still, the possibility is difficult to ignore, because if the condition had been identified earlier, the approach to treatment might have been different. The symptoms might have been managed in another way, and the progression might have been understood more clearly. These are not conclusions. They are questions, but they matter because they challenge the idea that this was a simple story with a single cause. And once you start looking at it this way, it becomes less about one explanation and more about a complex intersection of factors, neurological, emotional, and situational, all interacting at the same time. And that complexity is what makes this part of the story so unsettling, because it leaves us with something far less comfortable than a clear answer. It leaves us with uncertainty. Maybe we didn't get the story wrong on purpose, but we may have misunderstood it in a deeper way. When people talk about Robin Williams, they often reduce it to something familiar, a man who made the world laugh while quietly struggling inside. And while that version feels complete, it doesn't explain what he may have actually been going through. Because this wasn't only about emotion. It may have been about something far more unstable, a mind gradually losing its ability to process reality clearly, something that can't be fixed by perspective or willpower. And that changes how we see everything, because it means the struggle wasn't just internal in the way we usually imagine. It was structural, biological, something happening inside the brain itself that made clarity harder to hold on to. That's what makes this story difficult to sit with, because it forces us to accept how fragile the mind can be and how easily the signs can be misread when they don't fit what we expect. Maybe the real tragedy isn't just how his life ended, but that the full nature of what he was experiencing wasn't fully understood while he was going through it. And maybe the most unsettling part is realizing that stories like this are rarely simple. They exist in that space between what we think we understand and what we can't fully explain, where answers are incomplete and the truth is more complicated than we want it to be.
If this story made you see things differently, there are more stories like this, deeper, more complex, and often misunderstood, waiting on this channel. And the next one might change the way you look at things even more.